Hello and welcome to my presentation on the self-employed and saving for later life. Today I'm going to have a look at what's happened to pension saving for the self-employed, seeing what the big picture is. We're then going to turn and have a look at what the government's doing, what the latest from them is. And then the last section, I'm going to have a look at what we can do as an industry, how we can help encourage the self-employed to save more. So starting off then, what's happened to pension saving for the self-employed? You may well have seen some of the headlines that have been going around about this. First one I've got here is from towards the end of last year, talking about a pension saving crisis among the self-employed and about some quite dramatic figures there about savings falling off a cliff. It's put there with just 16% paying money into a retirement fund compared to 48% 20 years ago, which is I think we'll agree is a pretty significant difference. More recently, earlier this year, we've had more headlines, a couple of them quoting this £4 billion figure as the amount that's being lost due to pension inaction by the self-employed. You could argue whether that is an accurate figure or not. Really, it's based on comparing it to if those people were employees and what they would get. So actually, if they paid in at a similar level as required under auto-enrolment, then you'd have 3 billion of that would be coming from unemployed, which obviously in their case doesn't exist, but also there's £1 billion there of tax relief, which they're not getting. So it still is, there's a significant amount of money out there which could help boost retirement savings for the self-employed, which they're not claiming because they're not paying into pension and therefore they're not getting tax relief on it. A few sort of figures, some of the research, you can see what's been done. This one, first of all, is from the DWP National Statistics Family Resources Survey. So this looks at the 10-year period from 2010 to 2020 about pension scheme participation by employment status. So we can see at the start of the period, employed obviously have always had a higher participation, get my words out, than the self-employed. At the start of the period, you were looking then, sort of over 50% of employees being in a pension, paying into a pension, compared to maybe just over 20% of self-employed. It followed a similar pattern up until the introduction of auto-enrolment, and we can see there that auto-enrolment, is generally widely accepted as being very successful in boosting the numbers for employees paying into pension schemes. And so now we're up sort of around the 75% level, or we're back in 1920 for participation for employees, whereas the self-employed is down there at 18%. So on the previous slide, it did quote down to 16%, and I think there was 16%. It did dip a little bit lower, has come up very slightly more recently. But we can still see that even, we can see for employees, it's gone up here, but we can see the trend here, the self-employed has been generally been going downwards and getting worse over the period. The IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, did a very detailed report which came out at the end of last year, where they've looked over a longer period about retirement savings of the self-employed, going back to this research to 1998. Back then, there was 48% of the self-employed contributed to a private pension. So, there's obviously that last slide, sort of if it'd gone back further, it would have shown a much steeper decline because the levels used to be a lot higher. In 2018, that's where we get the 16% figure from, where it dropped all the way down. So it's not always been the case that the self-employed weren't saving. It is something that is, relatively new, or certainly worsened over the last 20 years or so. And at the same time as this decline taking place, the number of self-employed has grown significantly. Now, we have seen a slight drop off since COVID in the numbers of self-employed, but it's still, the trend before the pandemic was definitely an upward trend. So there's more people who fall into this category, and then a smaller percentage of them are contributing to pension, which obviously means that this is a growing issue. Also, it's interesting to see that last last bit of information on the slide there, that last bullet point there. Back in 1998, pension participation among private sector employees was an average around the same as the self-employed. So obviously public sector would have been higher, but if we take that out of the equation, we just look at private sector employees versus self-employed, the fact that it was about the same. Now, albeit obviously the employed levels have gone up because of auto-enrolment, but that doesn't explain it at all. So there's some quite significant, quite worrying differences, really. So the IFS, obviously, as part of their report, they've looked, at what the possible causes for this could be. But one of the main things they looked at was the changing characteristics of the self-employed. Has this changed? Who are self-employed? What does it look like? And this is just some extracts from that report. So the proportion of self-employed people who are female has gone up from 27% to 32% over the period. So, just over a quarter to just below a third. So, still obviously a lot more males, but there is a notable increase there in females who are self-employed. The average age has increased by a couple of years. Probably the most significant increase they found is in people who are working part-time, which you would think might explain some of it. If more people are working part-time, they probably don't have as much spare income to save into a pension. So that could explain some of it. But really, this next point here about average earnings increased in real terms until the start of the 2000s, because they started looking from 1998, but then they were flat for some years and then fell sharply during the financial crisis. So they're talking about the 2007-8 crisis, then nothing to do with COVID. So there's been significant falls in real terms of earnings for the self-employed. And in 2018-19, average earnings among self-employed are still lagging behind the 97-98 levels. So it's 2 decades of lost income growth among this group. So that is obviously, it's clearly that it will be significant. But does that explain the drop in savings in pensions? So that's the next thing that they've looked at. And what they've done on this chart here is demonstrate the fact that the changing characteristics only accounts for a small proportion of these changes. So what they've done here is said that if the relationship between the individual characteristics and pension saving, that relationship had stayed the same as it did in 1988, 1999, then we'd be on this top dotted line up here. This is what they would have expected to see happen. But this is what actually has happened. So the changing characteristics, the makeup of, the self-employed population, accounts for about 5% of the decrease, not the actual decrease, which is about 31%. So it's not just that as to why people aren't saving into pensions. There's also been some research done by the Office for National Statistics, some survey there where they've asked self-employed people, what are their reasons that they're not using pensions? And by far the biggest answer is affordability issues, which we can see on this chart here, this blue line here. So obviously significant. You can see post-financial crisis that rose significantly then. Interestingly, the next one on here is prefer alternative forms of savings, which I'll come to talk about a little bit more in just a moment. Over on this one, the biggest one we have is saying is that people aren't interested, which, I guess you think that could be true, maybe of a younger age group because it just seems so far off. But certainly as people get older, you think, really? Not interested in what you're going to live on, how you're going to live. It seems a strange thing not to be interested in. So certainly as people get older and it approaches. But looking back at, this question of, prefer alternative forms of savings, what's the picture there? So IFS looked at this as well, the pattern of non-pension savings. So they looked at everything excluding housing, your primary house, and they found that self-employed aren't saving in other ways either, I think is the short answer. So, or back in 1998 at the start here, they were saying about 80% of the self-employed was saving in some form or other outside of pensions, so savings account, ISAs, investment accounts. at a similar level to employees. I think, you can see there they were very, very close together. But self-employed, again, has dropped significantly, and significantly more than for the employed. Now, the employees is going up again. Put that down to so you can't even put that down to auto-enrolment because we're talking about non-pension. But we can see there is a divergence here. The only savings that have gone up for self-employed is housing savings, largely down to rising house prices. But obviously that's the same for employed and self-employed. That's the same picture. See house prices going up for everybody, but primary housing is taking up an increasing proportion of resources for the self-employed. So the conclusions then that the IFS made from their report was that, first of all, the decline is not significantly down to changing characteristics. That's not enough to explain those changes. Those that have historically saved the most within the self-employed group are those who are on a higher income and the long-term self-employed. And that group is the one that's had the most dramatic decline in savings, which is, slightly worrying. Those are the people, let's say, if they had the higher income, you'd say that, well, they're in the best position to be able to save. Do they have the most need to save because they're going to be used to having a higher standard of living whilst working, and for them to carry on with that in retirement? But also, if they're long-term self-employed, opposed to people that dip in and out of self-employment and have periods of employment, is that obviously if people are employed even for short periods, then they will have some pension savings unless they opt out now under automatic enrolment. Obviously, from our point of view, these are the people who are most likely, who have higher incomes, and long-term self-employed are probably the people who are most likely to seek advice. So maybe something we can do with that. As I said already, holdings of all other savings types have declined amongst the self-employed, so the only exception being primary housing wealth. But again, it doesn't explain that doesn't explain the divergence between self-employed and employed. A couple of things they did sort of say in their conclusions that they didn't look at, which could be a factor, is income volatility. They looked at current income levels for the self-employed, but they didn't look, say, volatility, which obviously may have an influence on how willing people are to save if their income is unreliable. And they didn't look at changes in spending patterns as to what people, particularly those people in the sort of the higher income groups, who used to be saving, what are they spending their money on? What are they doing with that money now if they're not saving it? And then the final conclusion they made is about those on very low income may find state pension sufficient. So, particularly, I suppose, people that are working part-time may have lower incomes. Obviously, the state pension, the new state pension, triple lock, is higher than it has been previously, and there is best provision now for self-employed with state pension. So it could be, obviously, but you are probably talking sort of people who have a fairly low standard of living to start with, very low incomes, but then they're used to being on a low income in their working life. Actually, for those people, it's not going to be as dramatic a change, finding themselves on state pension. Yeah, if they're used to not having that much income to start with. So moving on, what is the government doing about this issue then? Well, we have Guy Opperman, who was quoted earlier in the year, talking about the government remaining committed to increasing retirement savings among the self-employed, but warning there's no straightforward single mechanism to do this. I think we'd agree with that. But they are planning widespread trials in the summer, which we must be approaching pretty soon. Feels like it now, in using tech-based solutions to improve self-employed workers' pension savings. So these trials are sort of the next stage, building on from what they've already done, which is a research program with the DWP and Nest Insights have carried out. Most of this program was done pre-COVID, so they sort of do acknowledge that things have changed maybe since then. But what they did is they did a research program emailing self-employed, which they got the data from IPSE, so the Association of Independent Professionals and Self-Employed, and they also use Nest's self-employed members. So these two groups do look slightly different. The first one, the IPSE members, there, so just over 10,000 members, were the higher earners of the two groups, interestingly predominantly female as well, who are the IPSE members there. And then we had the Nest members, who are self-employed individuals who voluntarily set up membership of the Nest pension scheme. So to a certain degree, you think, well, they've actually taken some action off their own back anyway, these people, but it doesn't mean they're necessarily contributing regularly, or might have just been done a one-off thing and set up in some cases. So the Nest members were generally lower earners, but much more of an even split in terms of gender for that group. So what they did on these trials is that all the individuals on the trial were randomly selected to receive one of 4 messages by email. So they're trying to see how effective these messages were, so what difference they made to people's behaviour. And these were the 4 messages that they put out. First one was talking about palatable contributions. So it's the idea of affordability, because you say that was the biggest issue for most of the self-employed, is that they couldn't afford to save into a pension. So breaking it down to a daily amount, going, could you save £2.50 a day, makes it easier for people to digest and maybe think about. The second one they said was about flexible contributions. So emphasising the point, that you're not committed to making regular contributions of a set amount. You just pay in, when you can afford to. That is still better than not paying in at all. We then had one on tax relief, tax-free way to save for your retirement. So highlighting the benefits, the tax relief from pension contributions. And then finally was the fear of missing out, your FOMO one. Don't miss out on your pension returns, opportunity cost on that. So these were randomly selected, going out to both the IPSE and the Nest members. So people would get one of these 4 messages, and this is what they found. So the open rates on all of them were above benchmark, so they felt that the messages were relevant, potential engagement on them, no particular differences in open rates or click-throughs based on gender. In terms of age, they did find that the over 50s are more likely to open the tax relief email than those that were in their 30s, so there's a significant difference there. And when it comes to income levels, so obviously the IPSE members were more likely to be the higher earners, more likely to be higher rate taxpayers. So unsurprisingly, the tax relief email had the highest rate of all those messages for the higher earners. But Nest members, lower earners, wasn't a significant difference between the open or click-through rates on any of those 4 messages. Flexible contribution, so this idea of not being committed to having to make a regular contribution, just paying when you can afford it, and that don't lose out. Those ones appeared to resonate more with those who hadn't made any contributions in the last 2 years. So it had that data as well. So, and so as I sort of mentioned briefly before, so the government have done this, DWP along with Nest, as the initial stages of their research. And so the next bit is trying to find some tech-based solutions to improve engagement with pensions for the self-employed. And those trials, as they are set for the summer, so we'll be keeping an eye on those and seeing what happens with that. So, what can we do? What can we do as an industry? How can we help engage more self-employed, get them saving more? How can we encourage this extra savings? I do think it's interesting that the most significant drop in savings from the self-employed were amongst the highest earners within self-employed, and the ones that have historically saved more. And obviously those people are the people who are most likely to seek financial advice. And the biggest driver, based on those email trials, of how to engage those people was all around the tax savings. So, you know, the starting point might be just to, you know, remind people of the basics, you know, in simple terms, you know, this is what it looks like, this is what it costs you to save into a pension. So something like this, you know, it's just very, very basic how tax relief works. Now, this I'm looking at is for personal contributions. So anybody who is a sole trader and anybody that is an equity partner in a partnership will only be able to make personal contributions. So people who are self-employed in that way, they won't have obviously the option of an employer contribution. So I mean, partnerships can have employees and make employer contributions for employees, but they can't do it for the partners who are equity partners because they are self-employed. Obviously, normally when you talk about employer contributions, which I'll come on to in a minute, they are obviously, you talk about NI savings, but the thing to remember, obviously, with self-employed is that you pay lower rates of NI anyway, because you have your class 2 and your class 4 contributions rather than employer contributions for these people that are self-employed. So it's back to basics. So if you want to have £1,000 in your pension and you're a basic rate taxpayer, you pay in £800, you get basic rate tax relief in the pension of £200. There's nothing extra to claim. It costs you £800 to have £1,000 in your pension. Higher rate taxpayer, again, you pay in £800, get your basic rate relief in the scheme, get your extra rate relief claimed through your self-assessment tax return, or in some circumstances just by contacting HMRC, and the effective cost of saving £1,000 is there in your pension is therefore £600. And finally, your additional rate taxpayers, you know, again, you pay in £800, get your basic rate relief of £200, get your £250 through your tax return. It costs you £550 to get £1,000 into your pension. So it's reminding people of that, emphasising that point. For those of you that are north of the border or who have clients north of the border, obviously the rates are slightly different in Scotland, but the principle is the same. Actually, for those that are paying the starter rate of tax at 19%, so you still get 20% basic rate relief. You don't have to pay it back, so it makes it even better. And anyone earning is about £27,000, I think, for this tax year. If you're earning above that in Scotland, you actually pay more tax than you do in the rest of the UK. So therefore, the tax relief you get on pension contributions makes it even more attractive on that. One of the issues potentially for the self-employed particularly is obviously if they have income volatility, they don't know how much they're going to earn each year. It's unreliable, which can make the use of carry forward even more relevant, because you know, if you don't make pension contributions in a couple of years, you know, where you may be putting money back into the business or the business isn't as profitable, then you can not pay in for a few years. And then if you have a good year, you know, your earnings are higher, then you can use carry forward any unused allowance from your previous tax years and sort of make up for those lost contributions. And I say, particularly say when income is volatile, this can be particularly important. You always carry forward your unused allowance, not your tax relief. So, you know, if you've had virtually no income for a couple of years, that doesn't matter in terms of carry forward. If you suddenly have a bumper year, the fact you didn't have any money to pay in contributions in the early years, to say, doesn't matter. As long as you have the earnings in the current tax year that you're actually making the contribution, then you can pay in up to 100% of your earnings. As saying, you can carry forward your unused allowance for up to the last 3 tax years. You have to be a member of a UK registered pension scheme in the year that you are carrying forward from. So another point really is if you have people that are starting up self-employed, obviously a lot of them will probably be a member of a pension scheme somewhere, even if they're a deferred member, and that would be enough. But if people have absolutely no pension provision and they're starting up a business, pension probably, you know, isn't going to be the first thing they're thinking about. But actually, if you put them in a pension scheme, just make a minimum contribution in, you know, cheapest possible pension scheme, put it in there, and even if they don't pay in for a couple of years whilst they're building the business up, it gives them that ability to carry forward that, you know, in a couple of years' time, if they, you know, they've actually got some reasonable profits, they could use that to pay into the pension scheme, and because they were a member, they will have carry forward from previous years. You always use the current year's allowance first, and then the oldest unused allowance. So you use current year, go back 3 years, 2 years, and then last year on it. Okay, so that's for those that are self-employed, sole traders, partnerships. Obviously, you may also have self-employed business owners that are directors of a limited company. And if you look at, again, the tax relief message in sort of for them, got an example here where the company has £20,000 pre-tax profit and they want to distribute that to the director who's the owner, shareholder of the business. And you can look at the various ways you can do that. Historically, really, dividends, have been the preferred method, but obviously you can do it by bonus, you could do it by, say, dividends, or you could make a pension contribution. Thing to remember with dividends is that obviously you have to pay to all shareholders of the same class. So it will depend how it's structured, the company, whether that is an option or not. So looking at the options then, if you want to pay that £20,000 as a bonus, well, first of all, the employer will have to pay NI on it. So you don't actually going to pay, if you've only got £20,000 available, you can't actually pay out a £20,000 bonus. So the bonus after the employer NI on that at 13.8% works out as £17,574 because on that amount your employer NI is 2426. Then as an employee or the director receiving that, if they're a basic rate taxpayer, then they'll pay NI 12%, and then pay the tax 20% on it, and they take home just shy of £12,000 there. That's assuming somebody had a £20,000 salary before the bonus. So somebody's taking a fairly basic level of salary, which obviously is the case a lot of times for directors. They may take lower levels of salary and then on with dividends. If somebody's taking a higher level of salary, 60,000, so they're making the high rate taxpayer, the employee's NI at that level will be lower, but the tax will be higher, and then their take home there is just over £10,000. So that's one way you could pay that money out. Another way you could pay it out, obviously, is dividends. If you pay it out as dividends, if you've got £20,000 to distribute, first of all, you're going to have to pay corporation tax on it at 19%. You then will pay tax on it. Now, I'm assuming here that the director doesn't have any dividends, so they can use all of their £2,000 dividend allowance first and then just pay tax on the bit above that. For a basic rate taxpayer, 7.5%. Higher rate taxpayer, that's going to be at 32.5%. And then you can see what they take home here, just over 15,000 for a basic rate taxpayer, 11.5 just over for a higher rate taxpayer. But then you compare that to saving that money into a pension, and obviously very simple for an employer contribution going into a pension. It's £20,000. You can just put the whole lot in. Now, again, if you explain those options to somebody that's a business owner, if you're looking at those figures, that looks pretty attractive. So once it's in the pension, then you get compound tax-free growth up until whenever you access it, and then when you access it, you've got your 25% PCLS tax-free, and the rest of it will be taxable income in retirement. So it will depend obviously on what their tax rate is in retirement, but if a lot of people might be 20% on that, it's still going to look a pretty good option, so particularly with the compound tax-free growth element as well. So I say just reminding people of the basics, that can be quite powerful, I think. Another option, so we don't have to just be talking about pensions when we're talking about saving for retirement. Obviously, we do have ISAs, but particularly I'm just going to have a quick look at lifetime ISA before I finish. Now, lifetime ISA obviously isn't available to anybody. It's only going to be younger clients, so it have to be between age 18 and 39 on application. But once they're in, as long as you've opened the account and paid in, be like the day before the 40th birthday, then you can pay into the day before your 50th birthday, up to £4,000 a year. But then any payments that you make in, you get that 25% bonus on it, which does make it very attractive. And you can take the money out, first time house purchase, serious ill health, and really the important one for what we're talking about today is from age 60, so they can be used for savings for retirement. You can take money out in other circumstances, but with this 25% withdrawal charge. I suppose the attractive thing for lifetime ISAs for those that are eligible is that if people are worried about tying money up, because of income volatility, so a pension is very much tied up until you're 55 or 57 after 2028, before you can access it at all. Now, obviously, with a lifetime ISA, if you're using it for saving in retirement, you're not going to advising people to make withdrawals from it, but it does have that little bit that if you really needed it in an emergency, that you can access it still, albeit there is a penalty charge on it. But you've still got the bonus going in, and you've still got tax-free growth within the wrapper whilst it's in there. And for some people, just having that little bit of actually, if you really, really needed it, you could have it, might make it a little bit more attractive than a pension in the right circumstances. On the flip side of that, you do need to remember that it counts towards means testing, whereas, say, pension savings wouldn't do on that for people, say, volatile income who may at some point fall back on the state if that's ever likely to be an issue. In terms of the maths and what it looks like from a tax position, LISA versus pension pot, to get £1,000 into a LISA or a pension after the bonus stroke tax relief, depending which one we're talking about, you have to put £800 into a lifetime ISA to get your £200 bonus to bring that up to £1,000. But you take it out and it's completely tax-free. So it is a straightforward 25% uplift on the next cost. Obviously, with these figures, it's a very basic example and I'm ignoring your growth, but the growth is the same on both of them because they're both tax-free growth. Once the money's in there, the growth position will be identical for both, so it's not entirely relevant for comparison purposes. If we look at a pension by comparison, so what I've got here is this is a 20% basic rate taxpayer on the way in and 20% on the way out. If we look at them, you pay your £800 to get your £1,000 in your pension. When it comes to taking out, you get £250 of that tax-free. You pay your basic rate tax in retirement. Your post-tax outcome is £850. So your uplift on your £800 net cost to get to your £850 post-tax outcome is 6.25%. That position, LISA looks more attractive. You're not going to have many people in this column, 20% basic rate taxpayers paying in, 40% coming out. You definitely don't want the pension option on that one. But what is very attractive here is if you do have higher rate taxpayers paying into the pension, who are then basic rate taxpayers in retirement, because the net cost of £1,000 in the pension is only £600. Your post-tax outcome down here is £850. So you get this nice 41.67% uplift, which on the net cost to get you from the 600 to your 850. Which makes that one more attractive for people that are high rate taxpayers, so basic rate taxpayers in retirement. And then your final one is people who are high rate taxpayers when paying in and in retirement. And again, even there, the uplift on it, it looks better on the lifetime ISA if we're looking purely from the tax point of view and nothing else. So just to finish off then, just a couple of suggestions really in terms of what we could do. Accountancy connections is probably the obvious one for the self-employed, because most self-employed will have an accountant even if they don't have a financial advisor. So if you do have any connections, obviously that's a way into self-employed. Obviously talking to accountants, so they make sure they're aware of it to pass this message on, the advantages of the tax relief and pension contributions and how attractive they can be for the tax relief message, obviously thinking about provision for retirement. Flexibility could be key, especially if income volatility is an issue. So for pensions, don't forget you can use the carry forward option to mop up in good years and maybe not paying as much in less profitable years, and really looking at pension alternatives. So people want more flexibility, looking at ISAs as well for everybody, and lifetime ISAs for those that are eligible. And lifetime ISA as well, obviously that is for younger clients, and we all know that starting as young as possible will have the biggest impact in terms of savings for later life. Right, but that is all from me. So thank you very much. I hope that has been of interest, and goodbye.